There comes a time in every believer's life when you've done all you can, you've prayed, you've planned, you've pushed, and yet nothing seems to move. It's in that very moment that God whispers to your spirit, "Be still and let me lead." Stop trying to control what only God can direct. That is one of the hardest lessons a believer must learn, because everything in our human nature wants to be in charge. We like to plan, predict, and prepare for every possible outcome. We want to hold the pen and write the story ourselves. But when you belong to God, your life is no longer your own. You were bought with a price, and that means the author of your destiny already has the plot written. The problem is that sometimes we try to edit what God has already perfected. We think we know what's best for our future, but God sees what we cannot see. He knows the beginning, the middle, and the end. So when he tells us to wait, or when he closes a door we were desperate to walk through, it's not because he's withholding something good from us. It's because he knows what lies beyond that door. What looks like a missed opportunity could actually be his protection from something that would have broken us. When we try to take control of our own path, we often end up creating unnecessary frustration and pain. We pray for God's will, but deep down we want his will to match our plans. We say, "Lord, have your way," but then we start steering in the opposite direction when his way feels slow or uncomfortable. Control feels safe to our flesh, but it's dangerous to our spirit, because the moment we take control out of God's hands, we also take ourselves out of his covering. You cannot expect divine direction while insisting on human control. God cannot lead where we refuse to follow. Letting God lead you requires surrender, not a passive kind of surrender, but a conscious daily decision to trust him, even when you don't understand what he's doing. It means waking up every day and saying, "God, I don't know what today holds, but I trust you to hold me." It means being okay with not having all the answers, because you know the one who does. The truth is, control is an illusion. We never really had it to begin with. The breath in your lungs, the beating of your heart, the opportunities that come your way, they're all sustained by God's hand. When we finally admit that we're not in control, we position ourselves to experience the peace that comes from knowing God is. Many times we delay our own blessings because we won't release control. We try to rush seasons God hasn't prepared us for, or we hold on to people God has already released. But when you trust God's direction, you learn to let go without fear. You stop fighting what he's trying to change, and you start cooperating with his will. Think about Abraham. God told him to leave his homeland and go to a place he didn't know. Abraham had no map, no explanation, no guarantee except a promise. Yet he obeyed. That obedience opened the door to a covenant that would bless generations. If Abraham had tried to stay in control and refused to move until everything made sense, he would have missed his destiny. The same is true for you. God doesn't give details, he gives direction, and direction requires trust. When you stop trying to control, you start walking by faith instead of sight. Faith doesn't need the full picture, it just needs a word from God. Sometimes that word is simple: go, wait, or trust me. When you respond to that word in obedience, you release heaven's power over your situation. The storms may not disappear instantly, but your heart will have peace in the middle of them. Because you know that even if you don't understand the path, you trust the one who paved it. Control is heavy. It weighs you down with anxiety, fear, and exhaustion because you're carrying a burden you were never meant to bear. But when you surrender control, you exchange your burden for God's peace. You allow him to take the wheel and steer your life according to his timing and wisdom. And even when you don't know where you're going, you can rest in the truth that you are being led by the one who never makes a wrong turn. God doesn't need your help to fulfill his promises. He just needs your trust. And the moment you stop trying to control what only he can direct, you will find the freedom, clarity, and strength you've been searching for all along. Divine delays are not denials. This truth challenges our impatience and confronts our desire for instant answers. We live in a world that moves fast, where everything is available at the tap of a screen. Waiting feels like weakness, but in God's kingdom, waiting is not wasted time. It is sacred time. It's the space where God shapes us, strengthens us, and prepares us for what he has already designed. When God delays something in your life, it doesn't mean he has forgotten you or abandoned his promises. It simply means he's still working behind the scenes to align the right people, timing, and circumstances for your good and his glory. So many times we mistake God's silence for absence. We pray, we hope, we believe, but when nothing seems to move, doubt starts whispering that maybe it's not going to happen. Yet what we don't realize is that while we are waiting, God is orchestrating. Just because you can't see movement doesn't mean there isn't progress. The seed that's buried in the ground looks dead, but beneath the soil, it's developing roots. That's what divine delay is. It's God allowing your roots to grow deep before your blessing breaks through the surface. If you get it too soon, it might destroy you. If you wait for God's time, it will sustain you. Look at the story of Joseph. He had a dream from God at a young age, a vision of greatness and purpose. But before that dream came true, Joseph went through betrayal, slavery, false accusation, and prison. For years, it seemed like the dream was dead, but it wasn't denied. It was delayed because God was using that delay to build Joseph's character, to teach him humility, leadership, and dependence on divine timing. When the time was right, God raised him from the prison to the palace in a single moment. The delay wasn't punishment, it was preparation, and that's how God works. When he delays, he's not trying to disappoint you, he's trying to develop you. Sometimes the worst thing that could happen to us is for God to give us what we're praying for before we're ready. You might be asking for a platform, but your foundation isn't strong enough yet. You might be praying for a relationship, but your heart still needs healing. You might be asking for promotion, but your character still needs to mature. God knows that premature blessings can become painful burdens. So he delays, not to withhold, but to perfect. He is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. He is patient, allowing everything to unfold in divine order. Every delay in your life carries divine intention. There is something God is teaching you in the waiting that you could not learn in the winning. Waiting builds trust, and trust is the currency of faith. When you learn to trust God in the delay, you prove that your love for him is not based on what he gives, but on who he is. It's easy to worship when everything is happening fast, but real faith is built in the seasons when nothing seems to move. Those are the moments that refine you, that purify your motives, that strengthen your spiritual muscles. Moses experienced this. God called him to lead Israel out of Egypt, but before he ever stood before Pharaoh, he spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep. What looked like delay was actually training. God was preparing a shepherd's heart in him because the man who would lead people through the desert had to first learn patience and obedience in isolation. David experienced the same thing. He was anointed king as a young boy, but he didn't sit on the throne until many years later. In that time of waiting, God was shaping him into the kind of leader who could handle the weight of the crown. The delay developed the king within him. When you face a divine delay, you have two choices. You can let frustration make you doubt God's plan, or you can let faith remind you that his plan is still unfolding. Every delay carries hidden blessings that are revealed only through endurance. What if God is not denying you, but protecting you from walking into something too soon? What if the delay is the very thing saving you from disaster? His timing is perfect because he sees what you cannot see. The door you think should open might lead to a dead end, while the one you're not even looking at is being prepared to open wide when you're ready. God's delays often feel uncomfortable because they require surrender. They force you to trust his timing over your own desire. But when you come to that place of surrender, peace takes the place of panic. You stop rushing, stop comparing, and start resting in the truth that your story is not behind schedule. God's plans for you have not expired. The promise still stands. Every tear, every prayer, every moment of waiting is being used by God to build something beautiful. You may not understand it now, but one day you will look back and realize the delay was never denial. It was divine design. Trust God more than your own understanding. Those words sound simple, yet they cut deeply into the core of human nature. We like to make sense of everything. We analyze, calculate, and plan, believing that if we can just figure things out, we can control the outcome. But faith doesn't operate on human logic. Faith begins where understanding ends. When the Bible says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, it is calling us to a level of surrender that goes beyond reason. It means trusting God even when what he's doing doesn't make sense, even when his path feels uncertain, even when his silence feels heavy. There are moments when life will leave you standing in the middle of confusion. You prayed, you believed, you obeyed, yet things didn't go the way you thought they would. You expected open doors, but instead you ran into walls. You thought that person would stay, but they left. You believed that job would last, but it ended. In those moments, our natural instinct is to question God. We ask why. We wonder if we missed a sign. But what if God allowed those things not to punish you, but to protect you from something you couldn't see? What if the disappointment was actually divine direction? God's ways are higher than ours. His thoughts are beyond what we can comprehend. When we rely on our own understanding, we're trusting in a limited perspective. But when we trust God, we tap into divine wisdom that sees the full picture from beginning to end. Trusting God more than your understanding means you have to let go of the need to know everything. It means walking by faith, not by sight. Sight shows you facts, but faith shows you truth. Sight says there's no way forward, but faith says God can make a way out of no way. Sight focuses on what is seen. Faith holds on to what is promised. Sometimes the path God leads you on doesn't look like progress. It looks like confusion, setbacks, or even loss. But what feels like a step backward is often a setup for something greater. You may not see it now, but one day you'll understand that God was leading you through what you didn't want to face in order to prepare you for what you prayed to have. Think about the story of Noah. God told him to build an ark when there wasn't a cloud in the sky. That command didn't make sense. There was no sign of rain, no evidence that a flood was coming. If Noah had leaned on his understanding, he would have ignored God's voice. But because he trusted what God said more than what he saw, his obedience saved his family. The same is true for you. There are times when what God tells you won't line up with logic. He might tell you to walk away from something that looks good on the outside or to stay when your feelings want to run. He might tell you to give when you feel like you have nothing left. That's when faith is tested. Trust is not proven in comfort, it's proven in confusion. Your understanding is like looking at life through a keyhole, but God sees the entire room. He sees the people you haven't met yet, the opportunities that haven't appeared, and the dangers you can't detect. When he redirects you, it's not rejection, it's protection. Every closed door, every delay, every unexpected turn is God steering you toward his perfect plan. And when you learn to trust him above what you see, peace replaces panic. You no longer have to understand everything to have confidence in what he's doing. You simply rest in his sovereignty. There's a reason the Bible tells us to trust him with all our heart, not half, not most, but all. Because partial trust still leaves room for doubt. When you give God only part of your trust, you'll still wrestle with fear because a part of you still believes you have to figure things out yourself. But when you fully trust him, even when it makes no sense, you step into supernatural peace. You start to live with the confidence that even if things don't go according to your plan, they're still going according to his purpose. Trusting God more than your understanding doesn't mean ignoring wisdom or being careless. It means acknowledging that your wisdom has limits, but his doesn't. It means making plans, but surrendering the outcome. It means praying, God, I don't know how this will work out, but I believe you're already working it out. That kind of trust transforms your perspective. It takes you from worry to worship, from control to confidence. You begin to see that everything you've been through had a reason, even if you couldn't see it at the time. When you trust God more than your understanding, you give him permission to lead your life beyond what's comfortable. You stop living by explanations and start living by expectation. You stop trying to understand every detail and start believing that even in the mystery, he is still good. You stop leaning on what you can figure out and start resting in who you know is faithful. That's what real trust looks like, not knowing where the path leads, but being certain about who's leading the path. Obedience opens doors that effort never could. There is a difference between working hard and walking in obedience. Effort depends on your strength, your strategy, and your understanding. But obedience depends on God's instruction. Many people are exhausted because they are trying to achieve through effort what can only be received through obedience. They are pushing doors that were never meant to open, chasing opportunities that were never assigned to them, and fighting battles that were never theirs to fight. Yet when you learn to obey God even when it doesn't make sense, something supernatural happens. Your obedience becomes the key that unlocks what your talent, education, and connections never could. Obedience is not always convenient, and it rarely feels comfortable. God often gives instructions that seem unreasonable from a human perspective. He told Noah to build an ark when it had never rained. He told Abraham to leave his home without telling him where to go. He told Joshua to march around a wall instead of attacking it. He told Peter to cast his net on the other side after a night of failure. In every one of those moments, obedience didn't make sense, but it made miracles. Each of those men had a choice: to lean on their logic or to trust God's word. Every miracle began with obedience, not understanding. We often think blessings come through striving, but blessings are unlocked through surrender. God doesn't respond to effort, he responds to faith, and faith is proven through obedience. When you move at his word, you're telling heaven that you trust his timing, his wisdom, and his direction more than your own plans. That's why obedience carries so much power. It aligns your steps with divine timing. When you obey, you place yourself in position for God's favor to flow. You can't pray for breakthrough while ignoring the instructions that lead to it. Sometimes the very thing you're asking God for is waiting on the other side of a simple act of obedience. Obedience is not about perfection. It's about posture. It's about keeping your heart yielded to God's voice. You may not always get it right, but if your desire is to follow his lead, he will guide you. When you obey, you show God that you trust him, even when the outcome is uncertain. That kind of trust moves his heart. God honors obedience because obedience honors him. It's a demonstration of faith that says, Lord, I don't know how this will work, but I know you wouldn't ask me to move if you hadn't already made a way. Sometimes obedience requires walking away from something you want in order to walk into something God has prepared. It might mean letting go of people, places, or plans that don't fit your purpose. It might mean staying where you want to leave or leaving where you want to stay. Obedience will always cost you something, but it will never cost you more than disobedience will. Disobedience leads to delay, disappointment, and destruction. Obedience, even when it's painful, always leads to peace. God's instructions are not meant to restrict you, but to protect you and position you. When he tells you no, it's not to deprive you, but to direct you towards something better. Effort tries to control outcomes, but obedience trusts outcomes to God. Effort says, I'll make it happen. Obedience says, God, if you said it, I'll do it. There's nothing wrong with working hard, but hard work without God's direction leads to frustration. You can toil all night like Peter and catch nothing, or you can obey one word from Jesus and watch your nets overflow. One act of obedience can accomplish more in a moment than years of striving ever could. That's the power of obedience. It doesn't just move you forward, it moves heaven on your behalf. Obedience doesn't mean you'll always understand what God is doing, but it means you trust that he knows what's best. You may not see the full picture, but he does. You may think you're taking a step backward, but God is positioning you for promotion. Every time you choose obedience, you are planting seeds that will produce fruit in due season. Even when it looks like nothing is happening, your obedience is working in ways you can't see. God's blessings follow those who obey him. The Bible says that if you are willing and obedient, you will eat the good of the land. Willingness opens the door of your heart. Obedience opens the door of your destiny. You can't expect to walk in divine favor while walking in partial obedience. God doesn't bless rebellion, he blesses surrender. Obedience is not about rules, it's about relationship. It's about saying yes to the one who has never failed you. There are times when God will test your obedience with something small to prepare you for something greater. If he can trust you with simple instructions, he can trust you with significant assignments. Every great move of God begins with a small act of obedience. The miracles you're praying for are waiting for your yes. Your obedience today could be the reason someone else experiences breakthrough tomorrow. So don't underestimate what happens when you simply do what God says. When you obey, you invite his supernatural power into natural circumstances. Effort might get you recognition, but obedience brings revelation. Effort might build a name, but obedience builds a legacy. The door you've been knocking on for years might open not through striving, but through surrender, because obedience opens doors that effort never could. God's no is often his protection. That is a truth that every believer must come to understand, because at some point, each of us will pray for something that God does not allow. We will knock on doors that never open, chase opportunities that disappear, and ask for things that never come to pass. In those moments, it is easy to believe that God has forgotten us or that our faith wasn't strong enough. But the truth is, sometimes God's greatest mercy is hidden in his denial. What feels like rejection is often redirection, and what looks like loss is actually love. God sees what we cannot see, and because he knows the end from the beginning, he will say no when the yes we're asking for could harm us more than help us. There are times when God's no doesn't make sense to our minds. We cry, we plead, we fast, and we wait, and still he doesn't move the way we hoped. Our hearts ache with disappointment, and we wonder if he even hears us. But we must remember that God's perspective is eternal, while ours is temporary. He is not just thinking about what will make us happy today. He is shaping what will make us whole for eternity. A yes can be a blessing, but sometimes a no is a shield. When God says no, he is protecting us from unseen danger, unseen heartbreak, or unseen destruction. He is saving us from stepping into situations that would drain our peace, compromise our purpose, or lead us away from him. Every parent understands this on some level. When a child asks for something that could harm them, a loving parent says no, not out of cruelty, but out of care. The child may not understand it in the moment, but the parent sees the bigger picture. In the same way, God's no is never punishment, it is protection rooted in love. He knows what is waiting down the road, and sometimes he stops us before we walk into something that could derail our destiny. The job you didn't get, the relationship that ended, the door that closed, the opportunity that fell apart, all of it may have been God's way of keeping you safe from what you couldn't see. Think about Jonah. God told him to go to Nineveh, but Jonah ran in the opposite direction. When God sent a storm and had Jonah swallowed by a fish, it looked like punishment, but in truth, it was protection. God's no to Jonah's disobedience saved his life and restored his calling. The same God who closed the door on Jonah's escape was the one preparing a way for his redemption. Sometimes God's no comes wrapped in discomfort, but his goal is always our deliverance. We may resist it at first, but with time, we begin to see that the things we cried over were the very things God was saving us from. When we don't get what we prayed for, our faith is tested. We begin to wrestle with trust. We wonder if God really knows what he's doing, but that's when we must anchor ourselves in his character. God cannot make a mistake. His no is not a failure of his promise. It's the fulfillment of his wisdom. He knows when you're ready and when you're not. He knows who can go with you and who cannot. He knows which opportunities will bless you and which ones will break you. When you learn to trust His no, you begin to walk in real faith, the kind of faith that doesn't depend on outcomes, but on the one who ordains them. Sometimes God's no is the answer to prayers you didn't even know you prayed. Maybe you asked Him to use you, to grow you, to strengthen you, or to draw you closer to Him. Those kinds of prayers don't get answered in comfort. They get answered in correction. God will close doors, remove people, and redirect paths because He's answering your deeper prayer, the one that says, Lord, make me more like you. Every no is an opportunity to grow in trust. It's an invitation to surrender your will and align with His. When Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, He asked the Father to take the cup away from Him, but then He said, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. That was the greatest act of obedience ever recorded, and it came through a divine no. The Father's no to Jesus' request brought salvation to the world. When God says no, He's not ignoring your pain. He's working through it. He's closing one door to open another. He's removing what's temporary to give you what's eternal. His no is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of a better one. One day, you will look back on every unanswered prayer and thank God that He didn't give you what you wanted because His plan was far greater than your desire. His no will make sense when His yes arrives, and when it does, you'll see that every no was never rejection. It was divine protection. The safest place is not in control, it's in God's will. Every person at some point has tried to take control of life, believing that safety comes from certainty. We think that if we can plan every step, manage every detail, and predict every outcome, then we can protect ourselves from pain and disappointment. But the truth is, control is an illusion. No matter how hard we try to organize life, there will always be moments when things don't go according to plan. The people we depend on may change. The doors we rely on may close. And the future we expect may shift overnight. When that happens, control crumbles and fear creeps in. But when you live surrendered to God's will, you realize that safety was never found in control. It was always found in trust. Being in control gives a temporary sense of power, but it also brings the weight of pressure. You become responsible for outcomes you cannot guarantee. You start worrying about things that only God can handle. You stress over the timing of blessings, the behavior of people, and the direction of your life, forgetting that God never asked you to carry that load. He only asked you to trust Him. The moment you let go of control, you make space for His peace. Control breeds anxiety, but surrender births rest. The will of God may not always be comfortable, but it is always safe because His will is surrounded by His protection. When you walk in God's will, you're walking in divine covering. The path may not make sense, but it is always secure. Look at the story of Daniel in the lion's den. From a human perspective, the safest place would have been outside the den, away from danger. But for Daniel, the safest place was right in the center of God's will, even if that meant standing among lions. God shut the mouths of those lions because Daniel chose obedience over control. The same truth applies to us. Sometimes God's will leads us into places that look risky or uncomfortable, but those places carry supernatural safety because His presence goes with us. Control says, I'll make sure I'm safe. Faith says, God, I know I'm safe because you're with me. Control makes you depend on your ability, but faith makes you depend on His sovereignty. The more you try to control, the more you rob yourself of peace. When you finally surrender, you realize that safety was never about being in charge. It was about being in alignment. God's will is not a cage that limits you. It's a shelter that protects you. The boundaries of His will are not there to restrict your freedom, but to preserve your purpose. There's something powerful about being able to say, God, I don't know where this path is going, but I trust that you do. That's where peace begins. You may not have clarity about what's next, but you can have confidence in the one who holds your future. The safest place in the storm is not found in avoiding the waves. It's found in being in the boat with Jesus. The disciples learned that when they panicked during the storm, trying to control what they couldn't, but peace returned when they turned to the one who had authority over the wind and the sea. In the same way, your life will shift from fear to faith when you stop fighting for control and start resting in His command. When you live in God's will, you are untouchable until He says otherwise. No weapon formed against you can prosper because His plan for you is sealed. That doesn't mean you won't face challenges or pain, but it means that everything that touches your life must first pass through His hands. You can be in the middle of chaos and still have peace because you know who holds your tomorrow. Safety in God's will doesn't mean the absence of trouble. It means the assurance of His presence. There will be times when His will takes you where you didn't plan to go. It may take you through valleys, through seasons of waiting, through tests that stretch your faith, but even in those moments, you are still safe because you're in the hands of the one who knows how to bring beauty out of ashes. God's will is not always predictable, but it's always perfect. It may not always make you comfortable, but it will always make you complete. When you surrender control, you are no longer living as a victim of uncertainty. You're living as a vessel of divine direction. To be in control means to rely on human strength, but to be in God's will means to rely on divine wisdom. One will exhaust you, the other will sustain you. One will lead to worry, the other will lead to worship. When you finally stop fighting for control, you find that the peace you've been searching for was waiting on the other side of surrender. You begin to see that every detour, every delay, and every disappointment was part of God's design to keep you safe inside His will. Life becomes lighter because you realize that you don't have to understand everything. You just have to trust the one who does. The safest place is not at the top of your plan or at the center of your control. The safest place you will ever be is in the middle of God's will, where His presence guards, His power guides, and His peace sustains. So today, surrender the steering wheel. Let God drive, let Him lead, let Him guide your steps, because the safest place in all the world is not in control, it's in God's will. And when God leads you, you'll never end up lost. You'll end up right where you're meant to be.